trapped. 4 armed men had Maren Kendall backed against the bar of the Silver Boot Saloon, and everyone in that room knew one shot would change everything. Then came the sound nobody was braced for. Not a gunshot. The batwing doors parted, and a lone figure stepped into the lamp glow, blocking the only way out of that room. No badge on his chest, no name anyone in Cinder Creek had ever spoken. Just a trail-worn duster, a Colt worn low on his hip, and a stillness that made 4 armed men suddenly remember they were mortal. Montana Territory, autumn of 1884, was not a forgiving place for a woman who came west alone. Fortunes here were dug out of copper rock or buried beneath it, and the town of Cinder Creek belonged, in every practical sense, to one man. A man who had decided months earlier that a schoolteacher who wouldn't be run off the ridge above his mine. Before this hour in the Silver Boot was finished, one of them would be bleeding out on the sawdust floor, and a woman who had come west to teach children their letters was about to learn exactly what she was made of. Stay with me all the way through this one, because the man walking through those doors was carrying a debt 3 years old, and he had not ridden into Cinder Creek to collect it quietly. But to understand how Maren Kendall ended up with her spine against that bar and 4 hammers cocked in front of her, you have to go back to the spring before it happened, back to a newspaper advertisement folded into quarters in a carpet bag, and a train ticket bought with the last of an inheritance that wasn't much of one. Maren had grown up in a square white house in Concord, Massachusetts, the only child of a Union quartermaster who came home from the war with a bad lung and a worse temper toward waste of any kind, waste of grain. He taught her to read a ledger before she was 10, and to argue a point before she was 12, and when he died the winter she turned 23, he left her a modest sum, a trunk of books, and no earthly notion of what a woman alone was supposed to do with either. She could have stayed, she could have taken in sewing, or waited for a suitable widower to notice her at church, or done what unmarried women of good family were quietly expected to do, which was fade. Instead, she read, 3 weeks after the funeral, a single line in the back pages of a territorial newspaper her father had subscribed to out of some old habit of tracking the frontier. Wanted, one schoolteacher, Cinder Creek, Montana Territory. Must be firm, literate, and unafraid of hard country. Wages modest. Position urgent. She wrote back the same night, convincing herself it was the word urgent that decided her, though later, much later, she'd admit it was the word. The town that met her stagecoach in June was not what the advertisement had implied, and it was not what 4 years of finishing lessons had prepared her for. Cinder Creek sat in a fold of gray hills where copper had been found 8 years earlier, and where a man named Garrett Thorne had arrived not long after, with enough capital and enough hired guns to make sure that whatever came out of that ground. He owned the mine, he owned the assay office and the freight line that carried the ore east, and through the freight line he owned the mail, though nobody in town understood the last part yet. He owned the company's store, which meant he owned every miner's wages before they were even paid, since debt at the store came due before the pay envelope was opened. There was a sheriff's office with a tin star hanging crooked on a nail, but the man who wore it took his orders from Thorne long before he took them from any territorial law, and everybody in Cinder Creek had learned in one hard lesson or another. Maren stepped off that stage into a street of raw lumber and copper dust with her trunk of books and her father's old pocket compass, the one small vanity she'd allowed herself, a brass disc worn smooth from his thumb, and she looked at the town the way she'd look at an unruly classroom on the first day, not with fear but with the particular. dangerous confidence of a woman who has decided a thing is going to be civilized whether it wants to be or not. They gave her the old assayer's office up on Signal Ridge for a schoolhouse, a squat stone building abandoned 2 years earlier, when Thorne built a newer, closer assay shed down by the mine. Nobody had thought much about why the old building sat where it did on a shoulder of rock overlooking the river bend. The miners knew as Widow's Ford, a shallow hidden crossing screened by cottonwoods, the kind of place a man could walk 50 head of cattle across in the dark without half the valley knowing. Maren didn't think about it either, not at first. She thought about the leaking roof and the smell of old lamp oil, and how many desks she could bag or build. She swept that stone floor herself, on her hands and knees, for 3 straight days. She painted a blackboard with lampblack and linseed oil, because the freight line claimed a real one wouldn't arrive until spring, which turned out to be another small lie of Thorne's making. She wrote away for McGuffey readers and slates and a globe, paying for half of it herself, and when the crates finally came, weeks late, she unpacked them on the ridge in the wind, like a woman unwrapping Christmas. By September, she had gathered 12 children, most of them miners' sons and daughters, in patched coats, a few who could barely write their own names, one girl who'd never held a pencil in her life and cried the first time she broke the point. And there was Jem, 8 years old, quick as a fox, orphaned the winter before when a shaft collapse at the Thorne mine took his father along with 2 other men, a tragedy the company ledger recorded as an unavoidable accident. The town had more or less adopted Jem the way frontier towns do, a little food here, a spare cot there, but it was Maren's schoolhouse where the boy actually lived, in every sense that mattered, first through the door in the morning, last to leave at night, sweeping the floor without being prompted. She never put it into words, not even to herself. But Jem had become the reason she kept every other worry at arm's length. A woman fighting for one child's future. The town took to her slowly, the way frontier towns take to anything they haven't decided is safe yet. A few of the miners' wives came by that first month with a jar of preserves or a length of calico for curtains, gave quiet thanks for teaching their children to write their own names, and then hurried off again before anyone could see them lingering at the schoolhouse door too long. Maren understood, better than they knew, exactly what that hurrying meant. She taught geography with a second-hand globe that had a chip out of the Pacific Ocean, and taught arithmetic with kernels of dried corn for counting. And on Fridays she read aloud from whatever novel she'd managed to bring west in her trunk, doing all the voices herself while a dozen children sat cross-legged on the stone floor. That most of their fathers owed their souls to a company store. It was, she would think later, the happiest stretch of her life up to that point, and she didn't yet understand how much of that happiness Garrett Thorne had already decided he couldn't allow to continue. If you're the sort of person who likes a story with real teeth in it, a woman who refuses to fold, and a stranger who shows up owing a debt he intends to collect in full, then this channel is built for exactly that kind of evening. Go ahead and hit subscribe, tap that like button while you're at it, and settle in, because Cinder Creek is about to get a great deal more dangerous before it gets any better. It was Garrett Thorne's brother, Ezra, who noticed the lantern first. Ezra Thorne ran cattle for his older brother on the side, cattle that had a curious habit of appearing in Thorne herds with brands that didn't quite match their own bills of sale, moved across the territory in small lots at night, funneled through exactly one crossing on the whole stretch of river, Widow's Ford, screened by cottonwoods. sitting directly below the ridge where a new schoolteacher had taken to keeping a lamp burning past midnight while she graded slates and mended readers by hand. Ezra rode up to the schoolhouse on a bright October afternoon while Maren was still teaching, reined his horse in a lazy circle around the schoolyard fence, and fired 2 shots into the air, close enough that the children scattered screaming. He tipped his hat to Maren, afterward brushed it off his high spirits, and rode off, laughing. Maren wrote to the territorial marshal's office in Helena that same evening. It was the first of 4 letters she would send over the following month, each one carried out on Thorne's freight line, none of which would ever be seen again by anyone but the man who owned the line. The windows went next, 3 panes smashed with river stones on a night in late October, glass scattered across 2 rows of desks. She then spent a whole Saturday sweeping clean before the children could arrive Monday and see it. Then the well. Someone dropped a dead coyote carcass down the schoolyard water barrel, and Maren found it Tuesday morning by the smell before she found it by sight, and she stood over that barrel for a long moment with her jaw tight, and then she did something that would have scandalized her Concord relations to their bones. She rode into town, walked into the freight office where Cinder Creek's one gunsmith kept a modest stock behind the counter, and bought, on credit because Thorne's store extended credit to everyone that was half the trap, a double-barrel stagecoach shotgun. She kept it wrapped in a horse blanket under her desk from that day forward, and she confided in exactly no one, not even Jem. A miner's wife named Ruth Calder found her scrubbing coyote scent out of the water barrel with lye soap 2 days later, stood there a long moment without a word, and then quietly rolled up her own sleeves and helped, the 2 of them working in silence until the barrel smelled of lye instead of death. When they'd finished, Ruth straightened, looked toward the ridge and then back at Maren and gave her the closest thing to a warning anyone in Cinder Creek had yet dared offer outright. "Man like Thorne doesn't stop at a barrel, Miss Kendall. You ought to think hard on whether one lamp on this ridge is worth what it's going to cost you." Maren thanked her for the help and did not answer the rest of it, because she had already thought hard on it more than once, in the small hours when the wind came down off the hills and rattled the schoolhouse shutters, and she had already arrived at the only answer she intended to give anyone who wondered. She wrote her 4th and final letter to the marshal in early November. This one she didn't trust to the freight line. She wrote it herself, 6 miles out to a stage stop on the territorial road, and paid a passing drummer $2 to carry it the rest of the way east and post it from a town Thorne didn't own. It was the only letter of the 4 that ever actually reached Helena, and by the time it did, everything that letter had been trying to prevent had already happened twice over. Not everyone in Cinder Creek had gone entirely quiet in the shadow of Garrett Thorne. Obed Marsh, who ran the town's one undertaking parlor and had buried more men killed in Thorne's mine than he cared to count, would slip Maren a sack of nails or a length of stovepipe when she needed it, always after dark, always with a look over his shoulder. Hosea Lint, the blacksmith, mended her schoolhouse door hinge for nothing, and refused to take so much as a thank-you card for it, muttering something about a man having to live with himself. But kindness given in the dark is not the same as courage shown in daylight, and both men knew it, and so, in her own way, did Maren. Fear in Cinder Creek wasn't cowardice exactly, it was arithmetic. Every miner owed the company store more than his next 3 pay envelopes could cover, and a man who couldn't feed his children didn't have the luxury of principle. Thorne understood that arithmetic better than anyone alive, and he had built his entire kingdom on top of it. If you'd like more of these towns before anyone else finds them, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. It costs less than a cup of coffee, and it's what keeps a small operation like this one able to keep digging these stories up for you. Garrett Thorne, for his part, had tried patience first in his own crooked understanding of the word. He'd sent Ezra out with a bank draft the week the schoolhouse opened, an offer dressed up as a welcome gift, money enough for a comfortable train ticket back east, no hard feelings, Cinder Creek being no fit place for a lady of refinement. Maren had declined it politely, in writing, the way her father had taught her to decline a bad contract, and mailed her refusal back through the very freight office that made sure Thorne read it before anyone else did. It was in hindsight the moment Thorne stopped viewing her as an inconvenience and started viewing her as a threat, because a woman who wouldn't take money to leave was a woman who intended to stay, and a schoolteacher who intended to stay was a lantern, for as long as Garrett Thorne moved stolen cattle through it in the dark. The sheriff paid her one visit that same week, a tired gray man named Purdy, who had worn the Tin Star through two of Thorne's predecessors, and had long since stopped pretending even to himself. He didn't threaten her. He didn't need to. He simply sat his horse outside the schoolhouse fence for the length of a recess, watching the children at their games with an expression Maren couldn't quite read, and when she finally walked out to ask him plainly what he wanted, he allowed only that a smart woman knew when a fight wasn't hers to win, tipped his hat, and rode back down to town without waiting for an answer. She thought about that sentence more than she wanted to admit in the weeks that followed, mostly because some small, tired part of her suspected he might be right, and it was that same part of her she came to understand that Garrett Thorne was counting on to eventually win out. The note came on a Thursday in the second week of November, pinned to the schoolhouse door with a skinning knife, driven a full inch into the old wood. Maren found it at dusk, coming back from walking two of the smaller children partway home, and for one long, cold second, she simply stood and stared at the blade before she made herself reach for the paper beneath it. The handwriting was blunt and unpracticed. The boy's at the saloon. Come alone, or he doesn't walk out of it. Jem. She had left him not 20 minutes earlier, chopping kindling behind the boarding house the way he did most evenings before supper, humming some tuneless thing to himself the way boys do when they think no one's listening. She ran the 6 blocks into town so fast she lost a hairpin and didn't stop to find it, her mind racing through every version of a plan and discarding each one before she'd finished it. There was no marshal to send for. There was no sheriff who wasn't already Thorne's man. There was a shotgun, wrapped in a horse blanket under her desk, 6 miles back up on the ridge, and there was a wind picking up off the hills, kicking dust down Main Street in long gray sheets that stung her eyes and made the whole town look like it was already burning. She considered, for the length of 2 frantic blocks, knocking on Jose Lint's forge or Obed Marsh's parlor and asking one of them to come with her, and then made herself stop considering it. Whatever waited for her inside the Silver Boot wanted her alone, and dragging a blacksmith or an undertaker into that room would only give Thorne 2 more lives to spend instead of 1, with no better odds of getting Jem out safely for the trouble. This was, she reminded herself, a debt that had her name on it and no one else's, and she would not let another family in Cinder Creek pay down a debt that belonged to her. She thought about the shotgun the entire walk down from the ridge, and in the end she went back for it, not to carry it openly into a room full of Thorne's men, which would have gotten her shot on sight, but folded and broken down small enough to disappear beneath the wide skirts of her long wool traveling cloak, the same cloak she'd crossed half a continent in. It was an ungainly, desperate sort of concealment, the kind of thing that only works because nobody expects a schoolteacher to try it. And Maren Kendall, walking into the Silver Boot Saloon that evening with her chin up and terror sitting like a stone behind her ribs, was counting on exactly that. The saloon went silent when she stepped through the doors. Every miner who'd been nursing a beer at the bar found somewhere else to look. Garrett Thorne was seated at the corner table he always claimed as his own, and he rose when he saw her, unhurried, almost courtly, and behind him rose Ezra and Dutch Renner, a mountain of a man who'd broken more jaws for Thorne, whose eyes never seemed to blink, and whose reputation with a revolver was the reason most men in the territory gave him the whole width of a street. Thorne spread his hands like a man welcoming a guest to supper. "Miss Kendall. So, glad you could make the walk. Where is he?" 2 words, flat, no room in them for anything else. Thorne smiled the way he always smiled, like a man who already knew he'd won. "The boy's fine. Sleeping in my stable loft this minute, fed better than he's been fed in a month, I'd wager. This was never about the boy, Miss Kendall. It was about getting you off that ridge and into a room where we could finally have the conversation you've been avoiding since June." She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what the schoolhouse lantern had been doing to this man for 5 months, and exactly how badly she had underestimated the price of it. "You've got a lantern that burns till all hours, over a stretch of river that's none of a schoolteacher's business," Thorne went on, circling now. Ezra and Dutch fanning out to either side of her, while Whit drifted, silent, toward the door. "I offered you a train ticket in June. I'm offering you one more time, right now, free and clear, no hard feelings, and you get on the very next stage, east, and this whole unpleasant business goes away." Something shifted in his face, then some last thin veneer of hospitality burning off. "Then Dutch here walks you out the back, and Cinder Creek gets a new teacher who understands where she isn't wanted." They closed on her from 3 directions at once. Dutch's hand closed hard around her upper arm, and he half-dragged, half-marched her the last 6 feet, until her spine met the mahogany bar with a jolt that knocked the breath half out of her, and in the shove and the scramble of it in the one unwatched second, while 3 men's attention was on pinning her, the shotgun slid from beneath her cloak, down behind the bar rail out of every line of sight but her own, and she let it go without so much as a flinch, praying to whatever was listening that none of them had felt the weight leave her. Ezra drew first, then Whit, then Dutch, freed a hand to pull his own revolver, 3 hammers, cocking back almost in the same breath, and the whole saloon seemed to lean away from the bar all at once, miners ducking, low behind tables, the bartender flattening himself against the shelf of bottles at the far end. Thorne didn't draw. Thorne never had to. He simply stood there with his hands loose at his sides, watching Maren Kendall, the way a man watches an animal he's already decided is finished. Then, almost gently, that was the moment the whole room went still enough to hear dust settle. That was the moment 3 hammers stayed cocked and nobody's finger moved, because every man in that saloon was waiting for whatever came next, and what came next was not what any of them expected. He came in slow, unhurried, the last gray light of evening pouring in around him, and then swallowed as the doors swung shut at his back, sealing off the only way out of that room. He was dust-caked from a long ride, duster hanging past his knees, a cheroot burning low between two fingers of his left hand, his right hand hanging loose and easy near a Colt worn low on his thigh in a way that told anyone who knew guns exactly how much practice had gone into that particular kind of ease. He didn't look at Thorne first. He looked at Maren, one long, unhurried glance that seemed to take in the whole shape of the trouble she was standing in. And then he looked at the four men holding her there, and something in his face went very quiet and very cold. Thorne recovered his voice first, though not quite all of his composure. Saloons closed for the evening. Whoever you are, you'd best turn around and ride on. The stranger's voice was low and unbothered, the voice of a man who had spoken this next sentence or something close to it more than once before. Funny, I was about to tell you the same thing. Nobody in that saloon knew his name. Nobody had ever heard it spoken in Cinder Creek, not once. In all the months Garrett Thorne had run this town like his own private kingdom. He wore no badge, he carried no paper, and yet every man holding a gun on Maren Kendall felt, in the marrow of his own bones, that the arithmetic of the room had just changed completely, and that whatever came next was going to be settled the hard way. Maren, for her part, had gone very still against the bar, watching the stranger the way she might have watched an unfamiliar weather front, rolling in over the hills, not with relief exactly, not yet, but with the sudden sharpening awareness that everything about to happen in that room was about to happen very fast. She had spent 5 months learning to read the particular silences of Cinder Creek, the ones that meant nothing, and the ones that meant a man was about to draw, and the silence coming off the stranger in the doorway was unlike any she'd catalogued yet, not the coiled nervous quiet of a man working up his nerve, but the flat, settled quiet of a man who had already decided how the next 30 seconds were going to end, and was simply waiting, out of some old habit of manners, to let everyone else catch up to the arithmetic first. Ezra's revolver swung half toward the door. "This isn't your business, mister. Walk on out while you still can. See, that's where you're wrong." The stranger drew on the cheroot, let the smoke drift, unbothered by 4 cocked hammers in a way that made even Dutch Renner's confidence flicker. 3 years ago, a deputy United States Marshal was riding the copper circuit through this territory, chasing down a rustling operation that ran cattle across a hidden river crossing at night. He got close enough to know names. So, somebody backshot him from the cottonwoods at that crossing and left him to bleed out in the mud. And, when it finally came to trial, the circuit judge who heard the case decided there wasn't sufficient evidence to hang anybody for it. That marshal's name was Caleb. He was my brother. The saloon had gone so quiet you could hear the lamp wicks hiss. And, "Name's Silas," he said, and it was the first time, and very nearly the last time, anyone in Cinder Creek would ever hear him volunteer it. "I rode a long way to collect what's owed. Looks like I got here just in time to collect a second debt, along with the first." Garrett Thorne's hand dropped for his own revolver in the same instant. Ezra fired wide and panicked toward the door, and the Silver Boot Saloon came apart into thunder and gunsmoke. Silas moved like a man who had done this more times than he could count, and hated every one of them. He put Ezra down with a single shot before the echo of Ezra's own wild round had finished bouncing off the rafters, pivoted low, and took Whit Sorrel through the chest, a half second after Whit's revolver cleared leather. Dutch Renner, a mountain of a man who trusted his size over his speed, got off one shot that went wide into the ceiling before Silas's second bullet caught him low in the knee and folded him screaming to the floorboards, out of the fight for good but alive, which Maren would later understand was no accident. Silas killed exactly as many men as the moment demanded, and not one more. Garrett Thorne's shot caught Silas high in the left shoulder, spinning him half around against the bar, and for one terrible heartbeat, Maren thought she was about to watch him die standing up. Thorne thumbed his hammer back for a second shot, the one that would have finished it, and that was the exact half-second Maren Kendall came up from behind the bar with a stagecoach shotgun leveled across the mahogany rail, both barrels, and pulled both triggers at once. The blast took Garrett Thorne square in the chest and threw him backward into his own corner table, and Cinder Creek's 5-year kingdom ended in a spray of buckshot and splintered wood, and a silence so complete afterward that Maren could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Silas straightened slowly against the bar, one hand pressed hard to his bleeding shoulder, and looked down at what was left of Garrett Thorne for a long moment. Then he reached inside his duster with his good hand, drew out a folded, dust-worn federal warrant, and let it drop onto the dead man's chest. "Montana sends its regards," he said, quiet, almost tired. "Class dismissed. We're not even to the hardest part of this story yet, and I promise you, it gets worse before it gets better. So stay with me, because what happens over the next hour on that ridge is the whole reason this story got told at all." The saloon came back to life in pieces, a miner easing up from behind an overturned table, the bartender straightening bottles with shaking hands as if that would settle anything, someone finally remembering to run for Doc Abernathy. Maren set the shotgun down on the bar with hands that had gone numb and crossed the floor to Silas before her legs quite decided to carry her there and up close. In the lamplight, she could see how much blood had already soaked through his shirt at the shoulder, dark and spreading. "You're hurt." Possibly, she would think later, the least useful sentence a schoolteacher had ever spoken in her life. Seen worse, the words came through his teeth, tight and unconvincing. Doc Abernathy arrived at a near run, black bag banging against his leg, and set about cutting Silas's shirt away from the wound with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a man who had patched more gunshots in Cinder Creek than broken bones. Word of what had happened in the Silver Boot spread through the town faster than the doctor could finish his stitching, and with it came a second piece of news that turned the relief on every face back to something colder. Garrett Thorne was dead, but Garrett Thorne's operation didn't die with him. Out at a line camp 11 miles north, a man named Hoyt Slade ran the actual rustling crews for Thorne, 14 or 15 hard riders who moved cattle for a living and answered to nobody's law but their own boss's money. And money, once its owner turns up dead, has a way of turning men desperate rather than obedient. "He'll ride on the town," Silas said, wincing as Doc Abernathy pulled the last stitch tight. "Man like Slade, he's not coming to mourn. He's coming to burn out whoever killed the boss and make sure nobody in this territory thinks twice about crossing him next." Maren thought immediately of the ridge, the old stone assay office, thick-walled, high ground, a single narrow trail up from the valley floor that a man could defend with half the guns a mob needed to take it. She thought of 12 children who trusted her, and of Jem, still up in Thorne's stable loft, and she was already moving toward the door before she'd finished thinking it through in words. The schoolhouse. It's the only stone building on high ground for 2 miles. If they're coming, that's where we make them work for it. Silas looked at her for a long moment, blood loss pale and half a shoulder short of steady on his feet, and something that might almost have been a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, I've ridden with rangers who'd have taken longer to reach that conclusion. Before this story finishes, and it's a longer road yet, I want to say a genuine thank you to the folks who've already become members of this channel. Becoming one yourself helps keep stories like Maren's and Silas's coming. Just tap join right there beside the channel name, and you'll be doing more for this little operation than you probably realize. They had perhaps 3 hours before moonrise, and every one of them mattered." Silas, one arm bound tight against his ribs, directed the fortifying with a calm economical authority that made plain this was not remotely the first siege he'd sat through. Desks went up against the 2 ground-floor windows, stacked 2 and 3 high, leaving narrow firing gaps at shoulder height. Hosea Lint, once he understood what was coming, arrived with a sledgehammer and knocked crude firing ports through the old stone at the corners of the building without a second prompting, muttering the whole time about a man having to live with himself, the same words he'd used about the door hinge, except this time it came out sounding like something closer to pride. Obed Marsh brought every candle stub and lamp of coal oil he had in the parlor, then thought better of it and hauled half of it back down the hill, because a lit building on a ridge at night is a target long before it's a shelter. They doused every lantern inside and left one single shaded taper burning low behind a wall of stacked slates, just enough light to reload by. Maren spent that stretch of dusk doing the thing she was actually built for, in her own strange way, organizing. She lined up every shell for the shotgun in a neat row on the windowsill, the way she'd have lined up slates for a spelling lesson. She sent word down the hill for Jem to be fetched safely from Thorne's stable and kept in town away from what was coming, and only let herself feel the full weight of relief when a runner came back to confirm he was safe and sleeping, none the wiser about how close a thing his safety had actually been. Hoyt Slade's riders came up the valley road a little after midnight, torches burning, the sound of them reaching the ridge as a low drumming of hooves long before their shapes resolved out of the dark. 14 men, by Silas's count, made in a single grim glance through a firing port, more guns than the schoolhouse could hope to match head-on, and both of them knew it, and neither of them put it into words because there wasn't a version of that sentence that would have helped. "They'll ring the base of the trail first," Silas said, low, checking the load on a rifle Hosea Lint had left behind. "Try to draw fire, find our angles, don't waste a shot till you've got one worth taking." What followed was 2 hours that Maren Kendall would remember for the rest of her life in fragments, rather than any whole connected sequence. The flat crack of Silas's rifle from the northern port, methodical, unhurried, even wounded. The terrible sound a man makes when a bullet finds him in the dark. Twice, riders tried to work close enough to fling a burning bundle of oil-soaked rags through a firing gap, and twice Maren dropped them cold with the shotgun before either bundle left a hand, the second one close enough that she felt the heat of the torch even after the man carrying it had already fallen. She did not have time in those 2 hours to feel what she would feel later about any of it. There was only the next shell, the next gap, the next shape moving wrong against the dark, and a steady, terrible focus that surprised her more than the gunfire did. Once in the lull, between 2 waves of riders, she caught herself glancing toward the row of small desks stacked against the east window. The same desks 12 children sat behind every weekday morning, sounding out their letters while she walked the aisles. Jem was safe in town, she reminded herself, safe and sleeping and none the wiser, and she held on to that single fact the way a drowning woman holds onto a rope, because it was the only thing in that whole long night that let her keep loading and firing instead of folding to the floor and weeping for all 12 of them at once. Silas caught the look on her face somewhere in the second hour and read it correctly without needing an explanation. "They're not getting up this trail, Miss Kendall. Not tonight." It was not a promise he could have honestly guaranteed, and they both knew it. But she chose, in that moment, to believe him anyway, the same way she'd chosen to believe a great many things that autumn that had no business being true. It was the town that finally broke the siege, and not the schoolhouse. Down in Cinder Creek, men who had spent 5 years keeping their eyes on their own boots whenever Garrett Thorne's name came up, watched gunfire and torchlight crawl across the ridge where their children learned their letters. Obed Marsh and Hosea Lint had already broken into the company store's back room, the same armory Thorne had always kept stocked to remind the town who held the guns, never once imagining the town might one day use it against the men who'd installed it there. Some 24 miners and freight hands and shopkeepers were riding and running up the back trail behind the schoolhouse in a ragged, furious line, armed with whatever the armory and their own barns had given up. They hit Hoyt Slade's riders from behind. Out-of-ground Slade's men had never thought to watch, because no one in 5 years had ever given Cinder Creek reason to imagine it would fight back. The siege didn't end so much as it simply collapsed, riders wheeling their horses in the dark, uncertain now which direction held more guns, more than one of them deciding quite sensibly that a dead boss and a burning payroll weren't worth dying for after all. Hoyt Slade himself went down somewhere in the confusion of that final charge, and the rest scattered north into the hills in 2s and 3s and did not come back. It would be Obed Marsh of all people who later admitted what had actually turned 24 frightened men into a militia that night. Not courage exactly, he always maintained, though courage was certainly involved by the end of it, but the simple, unbearable sight of watching a schoolteacher who owed this town, when every man watching from below had spent 5 years running from far less. Man can only watch somebody else do his fighting for so long before he has to ask himself what kind of man that makes him, Obed told anyone who'd listen for years afterward, and Hosea Lint, standing beside him, never once disagreed. Dawn found Signal Ridge quiet, in a way it hadn't been in 5 years, smoke still curling off one scorched corner of stone. Spent shells scattered across the floorboards. Maren had swept clean with her own hands back in June, and Silas Rourke. Finally, allowing his knees to fold the moment the last hoofbeat faded south. He went down hard, all at once the blood loss and the ride and 2 hours of a man running on nothing but will finally catching up to him in a single stroke, and Maren was on the floor beside him before Doc Abernathy, summoned at a dead run from town, had even cleared the trail. It was Doc Abernathy who saved him over the course of that long day and the anxious night that followed. A shoulder wound gone worse from strain, a fever that ran high through the small hours while Maren sat beside a cot in the corner of her own schoolhouse and did not once, though she never afterward admitted to anyone exactly how long she'd sat there. By the second morning his fever had broken, and by the third day he could sit up unassisted and complain with real feeling about the food, which everyone present agreed was a promising sign. They talked more, in the days of that slow recovery, than either of them had talked to anyone in a long while. Silas was not a man built for easy conversation. Maren learned that early. in the long stretches of silence that followed most of his answers, but somewhere around the second afternoon, propped up in the corner cot with the schoolhouse smelling of camphor and coal smoke, he told her about Caleb without her having to ask twice. An older brother who'd taught him to shoot before he'd taught him much of anything else, who'd worn a badge because he actually believed in what it meant, who used to write letters home describing whatever territory he was riding through as though it were the finest country God had ever made, right up until the letters stopped coming and a telegram arrived instead. Maren in turn told him about Concord, about a father who loved her the only way he knew how, which was sternly and thoroughly and without much softness in the delivery, and about a newspaper advertisement she still wasn't entirely sure she'd been right to answer. Silas listened to that last part with an expression she couldn't quite name, and ventured after a moment that in his experience the people who worried most about whether they'd been right to do a brave thing. That third day was also the day Agent Corliss rode into Cinder Creek. He came alone, at first a lean man, in a gray suit that had no business in copper country, with two more riders trailing at a discreet distance, and a leather folder of papers he produced the moment he learned where the wounded stranger was recovering. He identified himself as a Pinkerton operative, retained, it turned out, by the very cattle syndicate that had quietly financed Garrett Thorne's operation for years, and he informed Doc Abernathy, and then the sheriff, and then anyone else who would listen, for the killing, 18 months prior, of a circuit judge in the southern part of the territory. The same judge, as it happened, who had once thrown out the case against his brother's murder. "The law doesn't care why a man does a thing," Corliss said, standing in the schoolhouse doorway with his folder of papers held out like it settled the matter on its own, "only that he did it. I'm here to collect him for transport, and I'd advise nobody make this harder than it has to be." Nobody in Cinder Creek had forgotten, 3 days on, exactly who had blocked a saloon door with his own body, while 4 armed men held a shotgun's width from a schoolteacher's throat. Tread moved through that town faster than Corliss's carriage had, and within the hour the schoolhouse trail up Signal Ridge was lined, quietly and without a single raised voice, by nearly every armed man, and more than a few armed women Cinder Creek had left standing, Hosea Lint with the same sledgehammer he'd used to knock firing ports through stone, Obed Marsh with a shotgun of his own, a dozen miners who 3 weeks earlier wouldn't have met Garrett Thorne's eye and now stood shoulder to shoulder on a ridge they'd bled for. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody had to. Agent Corliss looked out at a town that had clearly decided all together and all at once, exactly where it stood, folded his papers back into their leather case, and rode out before noon with considerably less confidence than he'd ridden in with. But Silas understood, better than anyone standing on that ridge, that Corliss riding off empty-handed today didn't mean the syndicate had finished asking. Men like that didn't stop because one agent lost his nerve. They simply sent the next one, and the one after that, and every day Silas stayed in Cinder Creek was a day he put the whole town back in the path of whatever came looking for him next. He healed fast, faster than Doc Abernathy entirely approved of, and by the second week of his recovery he could sit a horse again, and everyone in that schoolhouse, Maren most of all, understood exactly what that meant without needing to hear him say it out loud. He chose to leave at midnight the way he seemed to prefer doing most things, quiet, unannounced, drawing as little attention behind him as a man his size and his history could manage. He'd let it be known. In the careful, indirect way news traveled through Cinder Creek now, that he meant to ride north up toward the Canadian line, far enough that anyone still hunting him would be hunting empty country a long way from a schoolhouse Maren met him at the corral, wrapped in the same wool cloak that had once hidden a shotgun beneath it, her breath showing pale in the cold. Neither of them had much to add at first. There didn't seem to be a great deal that needed voicing after everything the two of them had already spoken to each other without words, on a bar top and behind a wall of stacked desks and across the length of a fevered night. You could stay. She let herself say it anyway, though she already knew, somewhere past a part of her that hoped, exactly what he'd answer. A man like me doesn't get to stop running. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while. He reached up and cupped her face with his good hand, his thumb tracing once gently along her cheekbone. But I wanted you to know. Somebody standing still long enough to teach a town's children their letters, against every reason this country gave her to quit, deserves to know somebody out there is grateful for it. For the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. She reached into her cloak and pressed her father's brass pocket compass into his hand, the one small vanity she'd carried the length of a continent, worn smooth from a dead man's thumb, and now, she supposed, about to be worn smoother still. "So you always know which way is north," she said, her voice not quite steady. "And which way is home, if you ever decide you want to find it again." He closed his fingers around it, and, for a moment, something moved across his face that had nothing to do with gunfights or federal warrants or dead brothers. Something that looked for just that one unguarded second like a man allowing himself to imagine a different life before setting the thought back down where it belonged. Then he reached inside his duster and pressed something of his own into her palm, in turn a worn deputy marshal's star, tarnished with 3 years of dust, his brother Caleb's, the only thing of Caleb's he'd carried with him since the Rio Grande. "Keep it somewhere. It can watch over those children," he said. "Man, it belonged to would have liked that a great deal better than it sitting in my saddlebag." He mounted, wincing only slightly at the shoulder that would ache. Doc Abernathy had warned him, for the rest of his life in cold weather. He looked back once from the top of the trail where Signal Ridge fell away toward the dark valley and the town beyond it, and then he rode north, into country that would keep swallowing men like him. And Maren Kendall stood at the corral fence until the sound of his horse had faded entirely into the wind off the hills, and then a good while longer after that. She never saw him again. That much, if you're wondering, the story doesn't soften for anyone, and I won't pretend otherwise just to give you a tidier ending. Ward drifted south now, and then, over the following years, the way word does in a country too big and too empty to keep secrets forever. A wanted man who rode with rangers here, a nameless stranger who broke up a land grab there, always moving. Always one territory ahead of whoever was still looking for him. Whether any of it was true, Maren never learned for certain, though she chose, quietly, and for the rest of her life, to believe every word of it. The old sheriff, Purdy, resigned his tin star within the month, unwilling or unable to explain to a town that had just fought its own battle why he'd spent 5 years pretending there was nothing worth fighting for. The miners elected a replacement themselves that winter, the first vote Cinder Creek had ever actually held for the office rather than accepted from Thorne's hand, and the company store opened its books to an elected committee soon after. That it had ever been any other way. Cinder Creek rebuilt itself in the years that followed, slower than most boom towns and steadier for it. Once it no longer had one man's fist wrapped around its throat. The town, grateful in the particular, lasting way that frontier towns remember exactly who stood their ground when it counted, helped her build a proper stone schoolhouse down in the valley, within 3 years. Real glass in every window. A bell in a little cupola that could be heard clear out to the mine. She taught there for the better part of 4 decades, taught Jem his letters, and then, 20 years later, taught Jem's own children theirs. 3 generations of Cinder Creek kids passing through her doorway long after the copper played out and the mine. She never married. There were men enough over the years who might have asked, and 1 or 2 who nearly did. But something in her had settled, that autumn on the ridge, onto a shape no ordinary proposal could quite fit around, and she never pretended otherwise to herself or to anyone who knew her well enough to ask. Jem grew up in that valley, knowing every version of the story Cinder Creek ever told about the night the schoolteacher and the nameless gunman held the ridge, and he was fond in his later years of pointing out that most of the tellings got smaller with time instead of larger, the way most frontier legends grow. Fewer riders, shorter siege, less blood. Because Maren Kendall herself was the one correcting the exaggerations every time she heard them, insisting on the plain facts, even when the plain facts were dramatic enough without any embellishing. She would tell it to her students when they were old enough to hear it properly, not as a story about a gunfight, but as a story about a town that had spent 5 years being afraid and had finally, on one long night, decided fear wasn't going to be the only thing it knew how to do. That, in her telling, was always the part worth remembering. The gunfight was just the night it happened to become true. They say, in the version of this story that got handed down through Cinder Creek long after everyone who lived it had passed on, that Maren Kendall kept a tarnished deputy marshal's star on a nail beside her schoolhouse blackboard for every one of those 40 years, polished bright every spring the same week she painted the fence. And that she never once explained to a single pupil what it meant or where it had come from, only that it belonged to a brave man, and that brave men, in her considered opinion. The West, in the end, wasn't tamed only by marshals and railroads and men with paper warrants in their saddlebags, whatever the history books like to claim. Sometimes it was tamed by a schoolteacher who wouldn't take a bribe to run, and by a nameless gunman who walked through a swinging door because a debt 3 years old finally came due, and by a town that had spent 5 years looking at its own boots, finally deciding on one long night to look up instead. If this is the kind of story you came here for, there's a whole channel of them waiting, so go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to help keep these stories coming, becoming a member takes about 10 seconds. Just tap join beside the channel name. Thank you for riding all the way to the end of this one with us. We'll see you in the next town down the line.